Greetings, Shabbat Shalom. As I speak, I always say, I don't know when you're going to hear this, but if you're hearing this soon after it's recorded, we're recording on what the calendar in general use would call September 21st of 2019. And not long from now, this year, will be the beginning of the autumn festival season, or what we in America would call the fall festivals. Now, speaking of festivals, I know that some people, for them, it's very much like the feast for people in the church. They save, and finally they get their chance to take their trip to Disney, whether it be perhaps California or out here in Florida. But those of you children out there, are there children out there who are Disney fans? I've got some riddles for you if you're Disney fans out there. Children, listen up for these riddles. When does Donald Duck wake up? At the quack of dawn. What did Daisy Duck say when she bought lipstick? Put it on my bill. Why does Peter Pan always fly? He's in Neverland. Why does Alice ask so many questions? She's in Wonderland. Well, I hope you children enjoyed those riddles. Today I want to speak very clearly, no riddles, about a very important subject. Because our time is our life. We have so much time, and that is it. And we write a certain record. Character is built, hopefully, and that is all that we take with us is our character, as we understand. And God has certain times He has set aside for us to, in effect, cease our typical work to survive and focus more on the spiritual side, our relationship with Him and our brothers and sisters in Christ. And there are times we continue to observe. There are times we continue to observe, year to year. Besides, of course, the weekly Sabbath that we observe week to week, all through the year. But we have certain annual days of rest. And Jesus Christ observed these days. We follow His example in observing these days. We follow the example of the apostles in observing these days. We continue to observe these times. In 1 Corinthians 11, in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 32, the Apostle Paul told the Christians at Corinth, "Give no offense, either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ." That's 1 Corinthians 11:1. And that verse, of course, can be taken in a broader sense, really in every way. Imitate your minister as he imitates Christ. Find yourself a minister who is really trying to imitate Christ, and then imitate that minister as he imitates Christ. Now, one way you can imitate me as I imitate Christ is by keeping God's appointed times. Now, one important reason to keep them is just that. They are God's appointed times. Now, people refer to them as the Jewish holidays, because He gave them originally to the people of Israel. The northern tribes were taken into captivity. That left the southern kingdom of Judah. So what was left of Israel were the Jews, who continued to observe these festivals and do so all the way up to this day. And the nation of Israel, which is the Jewish state, continues to observe these days as national holidays. So people think of them as Jewish holidays. But they were given to the people of Israel as God's appointed times. And so once a person becomes a part of the Church of God, he becomes spiritually a Jew, spiritual Israel. And these are days for the Christian to keep. If we go to Genesis, we see that God has created the heavens in such a way that human beings could devise a calendar. He inspired his people to have a calendar. That calendar has been preserved through the centuries, just as the Bible has been preserved through the centuries. And frankly, Christians inherited the Jewish Bible, whether they like it or not. And along with that comes the Jewish calendar. And the church inherits the Greek New Testament. They're the people that have preserved the New Testament for us, the Greeks. The church does not have authority to determine Scripture. It does not have authority to determine the calendar. The authority in the terms of the Scripture is with the Jews and the Greeks, and the calendar underlies the Old Testament, so that is where the authority regarding calendar is with the Jews. In Genesis 1:14, then God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night." Doesn't mean he created them at that time, but now they become discernible. You know, the atmosphere is so clear that they can be clearly seen. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons and for days and years." You know, let them be for Moadim, appointed times. And then God says in Leviticus, "These are my appointed times." He gave them to Israel, but they're his times. Leviticus 23 and verse 1. And the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the Moadim of the Eternal, the appointed time." Here it says feasts. The feasts of the Eternal, of course, they are times to feast, but they are, one of them is a fast day. So one of them is a time to fast. But most of them are times to feast, of course. But there is one that is a time to fast. But they are the feasts of the Eternal. They are appointed times of the Eternal. They're also called by the Jews in Hebrew Chagim. And of course, that's found in the Bible. They are called Chagim. And a Chag is a time to get together in a hug, in a circle. That is to say, to be in a community, to be with others, to be in a social circle. It's also a time, Chag, to go somewhere, to take a pilgrimage. You know, like you have in Arabic, a person goes to Mecca and he has the title, the person has the title Hajj. So the Chag is a time to go somewhere. So you go somewhere and you're in a social circle. And so it is a Chag. And these are Hagim. "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the feast of the Eternal, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts." Now when we come to the end of the chapter, verse 44, "So Moses declared to the children of Israel the feasts of the Eternal." You know, when you go through the Old Testament, you realize there is a fourth commandment of the 10, to keep the Sabbath. But you know, the holy days are also called Sabbaths. They are times to cease your regular work. They're times to come together for instruction. They're times to pray, to worship, to meditate on God's way of life. In Leviticus 23 and verse 24, speaking about the festival of trumpeting, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you shall have a Sabbath rest." Oh, so the term is used. I think the term in Hebrew is Shabbaton, which is related to Shabbat, a Sabbath rest, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. So the Festival of Trumpets is in effect an annual Sabbath. It's the beginning of the 7th month. The Sabbath is on the 7th day of the week. Festival of Trumpets is in the 7th month. Now, when you come to the 10th day of that month, you have a day which is a fast day. And look at verse 32. There it says, "It shall be a Shabbat Shabbaton." It shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest. I'm going to read Leviticus 23:32. "It shall be to you a Sabbath of solemn rest, and you shall afflict your souls on the 9th day of the month at evening." So the evening here is the end of that day. "From evening to evening you shall celebrate your Sabbath." So it's the 10th day of the month, which begins on the evening at the end of the 9th, and goes to the evening at the end of the 10th. Now, you see, therefore, that there's a weekly Sabbath and there are annual Sabbaths. And so in Leviticus 26, you might consider that it's not just discussing the weekly Sabbath, but also these annual holy days. Verse 2 of Leviticus 26, you shall keep my Sabbaths, it's plural there, and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Eternal. Now, it's true, you could say, well, Sabbaths, because there's one every week. But in the Ten Commandments, it just says keep the Sabbath or remember the Sabbath. It's not plural there. So one could argue that this could also include these annual holy days. And you see that God takes that very seriously. He takes the keeping of these days very seriously. All through the Bible, so much of the history of the church of God, which was ancient Israel. Ancient Israel was God's church anciently. And if you go through a history of the church, you see how important these holy days are. They picture, of course, critically important days in the history of the church. These are days to be remembered by every Bible-believing person. And they also have prophetic significance for every Bible-believing person. And they have Christological significance for those who understand the judeo-christian heritage. They have a Christological significance. So these are very important days, and spiritual revival is connected with these days. For example, I think if you go to 2 Chronicles, you'll find that at the time of Hezekiah, in 2 Chronicles, I'll go to verse 29, and you'll find there, I believe, that the revival of Israel there has to do with the keeping of the Passover. Let's go to the 30th chapter of Hezekiah. And Hezekiah sent to all Israel and Judah, so even to those who had already been taken into captivity, but there were still some left behind at that time, of the 10 tribes to the north. And Hezekiah sent to all Israel and Judah, and also wrote letters to Ephraim and Manasseh, that they should come to the house of the Eternal at Jerusalem to keep the Passover to the Eternal God of Israel. And this is at the time of Hezekiah. Then we can go later on and jump ahead. Now that the northern kingdom has disappeared from history, but we do have in 2 Kings, I want to go to the 23rd chapter of 2 Kings, and here you have a spiritual revival in 622 BC, and we have the Passover that was kept. And look at verse 22 of 2 Kings 23. In 2 Kings 23:22. Such a Passover surely had never been held since the days of the judges who judged Israel, nor in all the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. So there was such a unanimity of observance, such zeal, that it had not been equaled for centuries. So these are very important times of revival. And, we're about to enter the autumn festival days. So let's go now to the book of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah, the 8th chapter, you'll see there that before the revival that you read of later in the book, it's all preceded by the Festival of Trumpets and then the other festivals of this coming season that I'm speaking about now. Now, maybe you'll see this next spring. But in any case, I'm speaking before the coming of the fall festival days. And this is what's going on in Nehemiah 8 and verse 1. They're there keeping the Festival of Trumpets, and we go from there. This is a time of great spiritual revival. So really, all through the Old Testament, there's such a lot of significance given to these holy days. So for thousands of years of the history of God's church, these days play such a meaningful part. So now what are we supposed to do? Discard them at some point? Why would you discard them when they're so important? so meaningful. And look what happens when the New Testament history begins. Of course, we know that Jesus Christ observed these festivals. He was sinless. But what you may not have noticed, if you're maybe newer to the Bible or not as conversant with it, is how much of the New Testament revolves around the festivals. The Festivals of Leviticus 23. So much of the New Testament takes place around that time, around the time of these festivals, including, of course, the very climax of Jesus' ministry. And then we come to the book of Acts, and we're in the second chapter of Acts. And when does the church officially begin? On a holy day, on the day of Pentecost. And who begins the church? Who are the first church members? Devout, holy day keeping people. I'm in chapter 2 of Acts. When the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. And then verse 5, and there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. They had come from all over the world to be in Jerusalem for the festival of Pentecost. So, would the church then stop keeping Pentecost? It would seem not. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 8. Paul is writing to a Gentile church, and he tells them in 1 Corinthians 16:8, but I will tarry in Ephesus until Pentecost. Now, it's interesting that he talks to them that way about Pentecost. You kind of get the idea they were keeping Pentecost. I mean, I can't make you believe that, but it's certainly more likely than not. Now, let's go to the book of Acts. It's written by the physician of Paul, Luke, and evidently a Gentile if you read the book of Colossians. But Luke, the Gentile, went along with Paul, and he was part of the early church, and the early church was keeping these festivals. Well, the early church was initially Jewish. Of course, they'd be keeping these festivals. And you see that Luke is talking to the church in general. The book of Acts is written for people to read who are wanting to know about the history of the early church. And time is being kept by the festivals. Acts 20. Well, let's first go to Acts 18, verse 21. Paul says, I want to go to Jerusalem because there are going to be large crowds there, and it gives me an opportunity to speak to a lot of people. That's not what he says. He's going there not just to be there in order to have a lot of people to listen to him. He's there to keep the feast. Acts 18:21. But took leave. I'm jumping into the middle. When they asked him, verse 20, to stay a longer time with them, he did not consent, but took leave of them, saying, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem. But I'll return again to you, God willing, and he sailed from Ephesus. So he doesn't say, I want to be in Jerusalem for the feast. I want to be in Jerusalem to have access to a lot of people from all over the world. He says, I must all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem. I want to also go to Acts 20 and verse 6. Remember, he's speaking here about the general history of the church, Luke, and he keeps time by the festivals. Look at verse 6. But we sailed away from the Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days joined them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. He's keeping time. He's talking to them about the festival of unleavened bread. They sailed afterwards, evidently keeping it in one place and then moving on. Acts 27 and verse 9. The weather gets rough in autumn. It begins to get rainy and stormy. Not a time to be on a ship. That reminds me of a minister I talked to one year after the Festival of Tabernacles. They had decided to take a cruise in the Mediterranean. And he said to me, it was rough. We didn't pay attention to what the Apostle Paul said. Well, anyway, Acts 27 and verse 9. Now, this is Luke writing. Now, when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them. So the fast obviously is the fast, the Day of Atonement. So you certainly get the idea that the early church including the Gentiles, were keeping the festival days. As I said, I can't back you into a corner and make you believe that, but you'd have to reason, you'd have to kind of make excuses in order to think not. More likely you would think yes, that the early church was keeping these days. I'd like to go to 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter. And here again, there's more ways to understand this than just the one I'm going to give you, but the one I'm giving you ought to be considered. Here again, speaking to the church at Corinth, verse 7 of 1 Corinthians 5. Therefore, purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us. Obviously, it's much more effective to talk about these things if people are actually observing these things. Therefore, let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness. So, obviously, we don't want to use leaven, and we don't want to have spiritual leaven, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So, as I said, there are other ways to understand this, but if you just read along, it's certainly what I'm telling you is certainly worth considering. So, number one, these are God's appointed times. Number two, Jesus Christ observed them, but you could say, well, he had to be sinless under the old covenant. But you get the idea also that the early church observed them, that they were observed by the apostles and by the early church. Thirdly, the New Testament gives us no list of new appointed times. There's no list of new festivals that we should observe to replace them. Now, what does that mean? That we're not to have any festivals as Christians? That wouldn't seem the best way to develop a church culture, a church community, to not have annual days to remember. The weekly Sabbath is very important, but you would think that you would want to have annual days, and we do. And I did a dissertation a long time ago now on commandment keeping Christianity. That was the term I gave to it, to the movement of those who want to be Christians and keep the commandments. I called it commandment keeping Christianity. For the academic world, that was the label I put on it, and I explained in my dissertation why I used that label versus some other possible label. So anyway, I had a very eminent, very prominent group of a committee, frankly, and the head of the committee was a secular person. He was not he may have had some religious affiliation, or obviously he was a student of religion. I was in the Department of Religion and Social Ethics, but he was not what you call a religious person, and yet he appreciated my dissertation. And I think he said the strongest part of it, there were two things he really liked about my dissertation, and one I'll cover another time. But today, he said the strongest part of my dissertation was when I said, why did mainstream Christianity reject the biblical festivals and create their own, as he put it, de novo? They went ahead and made their own days. Now it's true. They did approximate the festivals. They did do, in effect, their version of the festivals. And some would say in some ways a perversion of them in some respects. But, the complex system that was developed, at least I'm familiar with in Catholicism. And, I don't want to be denigrating. I just want to say that I disagree with the approach they took. They in effect approximated the festivals or developed their own version of them rather than simply going along with what was already there. Because as I said, there is no list of festivals. There's no mention of festivals. Now, you could say the church took upon itself the authority to create them, and evidently that would be perhaps the Catholic position, that the church has the authority to, in effect, create a calendar of festivals. That would be perhaps their argument. But I think it's quite effective to say, why reject the days that God gave his people? Now, another point to consider is that nowhere are we told not to do it. We're not told anywhere in the Bible, I don't want you doing this. So again, If we're not told to abandon them, why abandon them? I want to go to Colossians, the second chapter. Colossians, the second chapter, and let's remember what these holy days are all about. They're all about God's plan of salvation, really, when you study into the meaning of them. And that's going to be another point I'm going to bring out in just a moment. You know, I've brought out 4 points so far. I brought out the fact that these holy days are God's holy days, that they were kept by Jesus Christ in the early church, that nowhere was a new list of festivals given. Nowhere were we told not to do them anymore. Now, there are certain verses people interpret in certain ways as being antinomian, I would say, and they need to be dealt with passage by passage. But I do want to go to a very important passage in the book of Colossians. Remember, these holy days for a Christian have tremendous symbolism. Let me just, I know that I don't really have the time to do this the way I want to, but let me just go to one example. In John 1, which I often point to, but let's go to the first chapter of John. And here in the 14th verse, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us," John 1:14, "and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." So God takes on humanity and dwells with us. And the Greek word here is related to the word for tabernacle. So God tabernacled with us. So this is one of the meanings for a Christian of the Festival of Tabernacles. The fact that God tabernacled with us, and in Revelation he's going to tabernacle with us in a more intense way in the future, in the New Jerusalem. And of course, much of the book of John takes place during the Festival of Tabernacles, and then I believe the 8th day of Sacred Assembly. So really, Jesus Christ is the hero of the holy days, and they really, for a Christian, revolve around God's plan of salvation. Central to that is Jesus Christ. And in Colossians 2, that's the point that's brought out. You know, that because we now are under the new covenant, we don't have to worry so much about the technicalities of the festival days. We should keep them in a non-judgmental way. The Pharisees had a very complex system of law involving each of the holy days, as you know, and the Sabbath. Very complex. And that's in a way a burden for the Jewish community today, because some Jews, because they don't want to deal with the complexities of it, have pretty much thrown the baby out with the bathwater. You know, it's hard to work out in a modern state of Israel a proper way for a modern 21st century state to observe these festivals, because the rabbis insist on, more or less my way or the highway, and so it makes it very difficult to compromise on those things. But anyway, in Colossians 2 and verse 16, he says, "So let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths," because in Colossae they emphasized the discipline of being ascetic and denying yourself certain of the pleasures of life and certain foods and so on. And now we have that idea today in the world. People think there are vegans who think they're much more virtuous because they're vegan and so forth. And, so he says, keep the festival, enjoy yourself, eat, drink, and keep the festival. And if you want to make a big deal about the new moon, you have at it. It's not a commanded day of rest in the Bible. We do note the new moon every month. We should keep track of the months. And for those of you who are regular viewers, you'll be soon receiving calendars from me, so you will be able to note the new moon each month when it comes. But they don't have to be observed as the holy days are. But as we observe them, we don't have to be judgmental. If for example, at the Festival of Tabernacles, we don't have to get pharisaical about what is a temporary dwelling. We don't have to certainly split the church over such things as that. Look at verse 17, because they're a shadow, because the substance is Jesus Christ. So these holy days that we keep, the focus must be on Jesus Christ. So let no one judge you in food or in drink or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. So as we keep these holy days as Christians, we're Christian commandment keepers, and Jesus Christ is really at the center of our thinking as we keep these coming festivals. Now, in very short time, as I'm speaking today, we have the first of the autumn festivals coming up, the Festival of Trumpeting, Yom Teruah, which is the beginning of the civil year. It's Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year. It's the beginning of the civil year on the sacred calendar. And there's so much in the Bible relating to the Festival of Trumpets. If you look at the book of Revelation, for example, you look at Revelation 8, and when he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And by the way, this is actually foreshadowed in the Jewish liturgy for that day, but I don't have time to get into that now. Verse 2, and I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. So the Festival of Trumpets pictures that a year. The Bible has the principle of a day for a year in prophecy. The Festival of Trumpets pictures a year, which is the climax of human history. It's the day of the Lord, and it begins with a particular year where God is judging the world. And sometime that year, probably after the days of unleavened bread, as we get into that year, at some point in that year will be the second coming of Christ, which will be at the 7th trumpet. So let's go to 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 51. And that's my final point of these 5 points that I'm making, is that these festivals have important significance for a Christian, and so as we keep them, we deepen our understanding of God's plan of salvation, and we have a much clearer view than those who don't keep these days. I do want to turn to one verse in the Psalms, and Psalm 111 in verse 10. This is an acrostic psalm. It's alphabetically organized, and I want to go to Psalm 111 in verse 10. Reshit Chochma Yirat Adonai Sechel Tov L'chol Osehem Tehilato Omedet La'ad. This is, I've said it in Hebrew while you're turning there. The fear of the eternal is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all those who do his commandments. His praise endures forever. The Hebrew is all those who do them. Well, what are the them? The commandments. So your Bible interprets it correctly, of course, as all those who do his commandments. So as we do them, we grow in understanding. So from year to year, we're going to grow in understanding of God's nature and his plan of salvation and our part in it, the church's part in it. And the Festival of Trumpets pictures this final year of the Lord, or final day of the Lord, which is going to be a year, but it's called the Day of the Lord. And in 1 Corinthians 15:51, we finally have that last trumpet, which signals the resurrection of the dead, triumph, the victory of God, the victory of his people. 1 Corinthians 50:51, behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. We're going to go from physical to spirit. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. This is the verse 52. At the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. So that Festival of Trumpets, as I speak, is coming up very, very soon. So as Christians, let's remember the importance of God's appointed times. Times we continue to observe. All the best for you, to you, and yours.